Hello, students. Dr. Martin here again. Picking up on our last conversation about bureaucracy as part of the executive branch, I just wanted to go through a few general features of what separates bureaucracies in the government, say, from what a private business looks like. And within the operations of the American government, what is it we see about different bureaucracies that do perform fairly well and ones that leave something to be desired? Obviously, you're going to see both pointed to in trying to make a political point by either of the two sides in this country's politics, but it's worthwhile seeing an example or two of what they actually look like in action. To start off with, it makes sense to look at the difference between a government bureaucracy's incentives and those of a private business. Briefly put, and this is something you'll probably want to underline, a business can make profits. A government agency has to make budgets. Profits versus budgets. Now, these don't necessarily have to be completely different, but there is in principle something that you can do with profits in a private business. Namely, you can reinvest them, you can raise salaries for your workers. It's a non-zero sum game. More can be created of value that can be distributed among the players involved. And so consequently, there are ways in which it works as a system of production and distribution that won't quite work the same way for the public sector of business. Government agency, what you have is a budget. A budget for a given agency is always something that the agency is trying to add on to. When each of the agencies of the federal government each year makes the case for why it should receive a certain budget to Congress, they will list a number of reasons as to why they think that their particular duties are the most essential to the United States government and therefore serving the American people. And they will no doubt insist that not only do they maintain their current level of funding, but it also be increased. I think you're probably correct in assuming, if you have already, that no one really wants to reduce the size of their budget, reduce the amount of money that's going to be spent for them. And so, consequently, what you'll probably see is the amount of work that is actually doable will expand to fill how much space is actually there budget wise for it to actually be done. So, bureaucracy can kind of increase mission creep, however you want to phrase it, as a result of trying to do its job better and, in effect, sometimes making work for itself, justifying the levels of funding it is trying to get in addition to the levels of funding it already has. Now, the reason why this is different from, say, what takes place in the private businesses in the marketplace is that here we're not talking about profits. It is a zero sum game trying to get budget money from the federal government for your agency. They cannot split these in such a way that more value is created to go around. Some will get it and some will not. And therefore, you're going to see the rules of how things are done, the rules of what things are made, and the rules of what services are provided just plain look different from government to a business. Sometimes the more interesting hybrids, however, can teach us something. And this is the kind of place that I would like to bring up some examples of the kind of bureaucracies or government agencies that are out there. And want to briefly talk about one that has historically been a bit dysfunctional and also one that seems to have some value that isn't always appreciated. First one, the question that's easy to pose is what is a particular agency that has some continuing problems? And the actual answer you can find right here in Lamoni, which is to say a post office. The United States Postal Service is sort of a quasi governmental corporation, so it's not necessarily directly overseen in its day-to-day actions by the federal government, but it is funded by the federal government. And unfortunately, what you have is an agency which for many years has not been on a sustainable business model. If you looked at a number of the indicators that are going to be out there, you'll find a situation in which they do have quite a reach. They have quite a few assets. In 2018, they delivered to over 150 million addresses and post office boxes throughout the country and territories of the U.S. They have almost 250,000 vehicles to haul mail, and they also have considerable retail locations. They've got around 31,000 post offices, an additional 4,000 additional contractor run sort of mail installations. Now, to a certain extent, they have a unique budget model insofar as they don't necessarily receive revenue from taxes. And that's more having to do with your postage. However, you're seeing a situation where their kind of business model is going to have some issues. One of the things that's the case is they have financial losses frequently and have for over a decade now, actually close to 20 years. In the fiscal year 2014, for example, the Postal Service had its eighth recorded loss in a row, year-wise, bringing the total deficit since the fiscal year of, at that time, 2007 to up to $51.7 billion. And if you look at that, it's pretty much continued ever since. And so you have a situation in which there are a number of pressures that are impinging on the post office. And this is something where government agencies may have to vie with private business to deal with these sorts of things. One big one, obviously, being one of their principal ways of making money was shipping parcels. And you could probably tell just how many cases that is no longer their corner on the business. You'll probably see Amazon, FedEx, the likes of obviously UPS, that have really made their particular business model a little bit having to be pressured from competition. And therefore, to what extent they can actually fund themselves is getting to be a little bit more difficult. Similarly, obviously, email did this to a certain extent. And all these especially impinge right around a specific time, in which I think you're all familiar, which is to say the holidays, Christmas and related holidays. And so, therefore, you really have them coming to the federal government many times to try and see if they can get some support from the federal government itself. Now, why is it that they're having these problems? This is something that will be common to many bureaucracies in government at all levels, is particularly because of paying more in workers' compensation costs and retiree health benefits. In other words, retirement and health care for their workers. 40 to 50 years ago, for many agencies throughout the government at all levels, you had different contracts that were struck with the unions to try and make sure that they provided adequately for retirement and for healthcare needs. In many cases, what you've had more recently is those costs must be paid first before the post office actually takes care of its general expenses. And so, with that legacy, they've been forced to deal with a variety of issues, a variety of problems. Now, to a certain extent, you have seen the results of this. You've seen the ways in which you've had closing of many rural post offices. You've seen in many parts of the country reduced hours, many cases a reduced number of letter carriers. So just as with many other kinds of organization, not just bureaucracies, but a government bureaucracy in particular in this case, needing to scale back their budgets and scale back their work. One way to try and solve a solution when it comes to whether or not you can have a particular funding of an agency work well or have that service perform for the public is to contract it out, privatize that service, in effect. The government has considered that in certain ways. You've seen that more recently in times when you've had, say, instances where post office services are technically going to be farmed out or at a particular location for them put in, say, a store. Say, like Staples, the office supplies store, where they had a number of years back, trial installations by the federal government putting post office services there, which were widely denounced and protested by the postal workers' unions, as you might expect. So, this is an example of a particular organization, government agency, or affiliated with the government that's had a number of problems because of the way that it does business and in the way that it has had to adjust to the business model in the larger environment, the private marketplace that it works in. Speaking of agencies that may be a little bit more functional and also perhaps have some value that we don't always consider, one that you might want to consider is called DARPA. DARPA is the acronym. And this is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. Now, one of the things that it is what you usually don't see. Namely, a lot of it was purely scientific research, not necessarily applied for any one purpose. Pure scientific research, probably it starts, I'd say, with only less than 150 scientists and experts. The joke was 100 geniuses and a travel agent. Basically, put together at a certain time in this country's past during the Cold War when it was feared that the Soviet Union would have an edge over this country in terms of raw talent in science and math, and therefore the next Sputnik, the next Apollo, whichever kinds of advances in the space race or the arms race were going to be made, this country wanted to be first, and therefore it felt it needed the brightest people in the labs actually taking part in it. And actually, they've put together a number of interesting applications for defense which have spun off into things you know. Particularly, there was this one thing that in 1969 the agency put together called ARPANET. This was an internal network for use in connecting different kinds of academic research labs and the kind of hubs for those research in which they did. The reason why they did this is because they wanted to see what would happen if they decentralized this kind of network in the event that there is a nuclear strike. They don't want such a strike taking out all of the United States command and control, so can you distribute these across networks? Well, interesting thing about that, you know this every day. You know of this network every day because it's called the internet. Basically, the earliest prototype of the internet is ARPANET. So, in effect, the federal government is partially responsible for creating the internet as you know it. So, I think hopefully what you can see here is that there is going to be ways in which the federal government's bureaucracies can perform well and ways in which they can't.